Qatar and Egypt confirm the 4-day humanitarian truce in Gaza will be extended by 2 more days, raising hopes that more aid will reach Palestinians in the besieged enclave.
EU's foreign policy chief calls for a long-term truce and a peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians.
The world's largest international police organisation, Interpol, calls for a global response to the rise in cross-border crime on the agency's 100th anniversary. Rafah, on Gaza's border with Egypt, and what was supposed to be the final day of a humanitarian truce between Israel and the Hamas militant group. But Qatar says the pause will be extended by 2 more days. Hamas has acknowledged the move mitigated by officials in Doha and Cairo. Israel says it wants more hostages freed.
When Hamas stops releasing hostages under the existing framework, Israel will return to realising our 3 goals with full force: eliminating Hamas, ensuring that Gaza never again pose a threat to the people of Israel, and of course releasing all of our hostages.
The move raises hopes that more aid trucks will be able to enter the war-ravaged enclave. This after the Red Crescent announced it was unable to deliver essential supplies to communities in northern Gaza on Monday. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is calling for a complete ceasefire, while Doctors Without Borders says the situation in Gaza is dire.
A diplomatic spat has evolved between Israel and 3 countries in the European Union: Ireland, Spain and Belgium. The ambassadors for the 3 countries have been called in for diplomatic castigation in Tel Aviv. Belgian and Spanish prime ministers called on Israel to end the suffering of Palestinians during a recent visit to the Rafah border. Spain's Pedro Sanchez described the attacks on civilians in Gaza as unbearable and unacceptable and said the EU should recognise a Palestinian state. The 2 also reiterated Israel's right to defend itself and called for Hamas to release all hostages. Meanwhile, the Israeli foreign minister responded by saying, "We condemn the false claims of prime ministers of Belgium and Spain, which support terrorism." Meanwhile, the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar used a quote from the song Amazing Grace in welcoming the release of Irish-Israeli girl Emily Hand, who was taken hostage by Hamas. The Israeli president said the quote was unacceptable as it described her being lost and not kidnapped, although the Prime Minister did reiterate she had been kidnapped further in his statement. Irish MEP Billy Kelleher says he's disappointed with the reaction in Israel.
We now have the Israeli government and the Israeli diplomatic service, undermining people who just challenge Israel on the basics of complying with international law, on the basics of allowing humanitarian aid in and out of Gaza, on the basics of allowing medicines, water and just electricity, and the basics of necessity to flow in across the Rafah crossing into Gaza. So, being honest, I'm very disappointed with the diplomatic effort to undermine countries that have always been acting in good faith around the issue of the 2-state solution and the need for there to be a permanent settlement and a peace process in the Middle East itself.
In the meantime, the EU's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell has been calling for prolonging the truce in Gaza. While an extra 2 days pause in hostilities has been agreed, Borrell indicated he would like for the fighting to stop. He was speaking at the Mediterranean Forum, attended by Middle Eastern countries. Israel declined to attend this year.
Hemos tenido una pausa en los combates que tiene que extenderse hasta llegar a hacer posible una solución política que permita romper el ciclo de la violencia.
Israel has vowed to continue its war, saying it won't stop until Hamas is defeated. However, Israeli government sources have told Euronews the US is putting pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to moderate its military offensive to limit civilian casualties. Shona Murray, Euronews, Brussels.
The battle for Avdiivka is taking its toll on the Russian army. According to Ukrainian press agency Euromaidan, Moscow's units failed in their latest attempt to block access to the city. A report released on Monday shows 930 Russian soldiers on average were killed each day in November. That's 140 more than the previous record set in March at the height of Russian attacks on the town of Bakhmut. British intelligence did not provide information about Ukrainian losses. A group of wives of Russian soldiers have made an appeal for the return of their husbands in a petition. They claim problems on the front line are being swept under the carpet so as not to jeopardize Russian President Vladimir Putin's re-election next year. Meanwhile, in Kharkiv, Ukrainian troops praised the range of the Leopard tanks that Denmark started to deliver in September. Over the coming weeks, Ukraine will receive 10 more, as well as extra ammunition and vehicles from Germany.
High waves and gale force winds batter Russia's south coast in what authorities are calling the storm of the century. 2 deaths have been reported. Rescuers have evacuated more than 350 people from their homes amid severe flooding. In Crimea, almost 500,000 people have been left without power. 1 person was killed in the region. Roofs and cars were also damaged by falling trees. This after the same weather front hit Romania and Moldova on Sunday. The Russian-installed government has declared a state of emergency and told residents to stay at home. At an aquarium in Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea, around 800 exotic fish and sea creatures died after the room they were in was flooded. Meanwhile, heavy snowfall has affected large parts of Ukraine. At least 2,000 villages and towns across the country are without electricity. Emergency services and police were called to assist some 840 vehicles stuck in the snow. At least 3 people have died in Odessa after reportedly freezing to death. President Volodymyr Zelensky also called on people to remain vigilant and expressed thanks to soldiers on the front fighting for Ukraine's freedom, despite the difficult conditions at Kupiansk, Avdiivka and Zaporizhia. More heavy sleet, rain and snow cover are forecast. Demonstrators on the streets of Dublin denouncing the violent clashes in the capital last week. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions called workers to assemble outside the centuries-old General Post Office to condemn the, quote, unacceptable and outrageous thuggery seen in the city centre. The authorities are blaming far-right groups for the xenophobic and racist nature of the unrest. 2 victims of a knife attack outside a school on Thursday are still in hospital. News of the incident quickly spread and the clashes ensued. One of the victims, a 5-year-old girl, is still in critical condition.
Finance will likely be at the heart of the UN's COP28 climate summit starting Thursday in Dubai. According to economists, around $1 trillion per year is needed to support developing countries in their climate action. One example is Pakistan, a very poor country which was almost completely flooded in 2022. Although it emits less than 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, natural disasters are ever more common and devastating. During the climate summit, an agreement could be reached on how much money will go to a new loss and damage fund. It's meant to pay for the expensive consequences of extreme weather events.
The European Union has clearly signaled its willingness to support this with contributions that are substantial, which is likely going to be in the order of the billions of euros. On the other hand, the US instead is, by the voice of John Kerry, has also announced contributions of millions of dollars, which is a very different scale of magnitude. And still open is the question of, will countries that were considered developing in 1992, like Saudi Arabia and China, will they contribute or not?
The European Parliament will send a 12-member delegation to COP28, and socialist members are already defending the high money contributions needed as a show of global solidarity. They will propose in the coming months that a similar fund be created just for the EU.
We need to help people adapt to the new situation. We need to help farmers so that they can continue grow crops that are much more resistant and resilient when it comes to climate change. Because at the end of the day, if we help the vulnerable communities, we create support for the European Green Deal, and that is something we all benefit from.
It's important to remember that rich countries are still missing out on the first fund created in 2019. The UN's Green Climate Fund should have collected $100 billion every year to help developing countries to invest in the transition to clean energy systems. The centre-right EPP group's COP28 delegate says that this should be achieved as soon as possible.
In the end of the day, we have to acknowledge the fact that the European Union is indeed doing its best for climate transition. But if we don't do it along with the US, China, India, we cannot mitigate climate change.
Thousands of politicians and scientific advisors at COP28 are expected to issue recommendations on a new framework for international climate finance, as well as a definitive roadmap on how to implement them.
Heavy rain and strong winds caused major flooding in Turkey over the weekend. The western, southern and northern regions were all hit by atrocious weather. Meteorological authorities issued an orange code for the Antalya region. The storm brought down many trees, giant waves formed on the beach and some boats were damaged. Heavy rain also paralysed traffic. After the storm in Izmir, the sea overflowed, some coastline neighbourhoods flooded and many boats tied to the shore sank.
Dutchman Joran van der Sloot, just one of the tens of thousands of convicted criminals identified and located thanks to international police cooperation. Interpol, the international law enforcement agency which coordinated this man's extradition, marks 100 years of service on Tuesday. Despite its many wins, the organisation's chief Jürgen Stock says cross-border crimes are increasing.
We are currently facing an epidemic of transnational organised crime which is undermining societies, communities and businesses. It is now so significant that it has become a global security emergency.
Stock has promised to announce a so-called Vienna Declaration later this week to combat cross-border crime. Interpol currently boasts 19 global databases which are used to identify some 15 victims of child abuse globally every day.